Nobody on the Meridian paid much attention to Riva Ose. She was 19, small, quiet, and she worked in the back corner of the communications bay where the lighting was bad and the coffee machine was broken. She sat cross-legged in her chair most days, headphones on, running signal decryption routines while the rest of the crew handled what they considered the real work. That was fine with Riva. She preferred it that way. The Meridian was a human diplomatic vessel, one of the first sent beyond the outer colonies. It was not a warship. It carried no heavy weapons, no fighter squadrons, no military detachments beyond a small security team. Earth's Galactic Relations Office had sent it to the Sauron system to negotiate with the Hetari Dominion on behalf of the Peluri, a gentle herbivorous species who had been displaced from their homeworld by Hetari expansion. The Hetari had conquered over 40 species across 3 galactic sectors. They were tall, four-armed, armored with natural bone plating, and they considered warfare to be the highest form of civilization. Their commander, a warlord named Drisic, had never lost a campaign. He had never even come close. Riva knew all of this because she had been intercepting Hetari communications for 3 weeks. Not because anyone had asked her to. She had simply noticed the signals bleeding through the static on an unsecured frequency and started decrypting them out of curiosity. What she found was interesting. Drisic talked a lot. He gave speeches to his fleet almost daily. And in his most recent broadcast, he had called Earth the galaxy's petting zoo and described humans as the softest species to ever stumble into the stars. His officers had laughed. The broadcast had been played on repeat across the Hetari fleet for entertainment. Riva had listened to it 4 times. Not because it offended her, because she was studying the way Drisic structured his thoughts. The way he organized his insults followed the same pattern as his tactical orders. He thought in layers, always building from mockery to threat to action. It told her something about how his mind worked. She flagged the intercepts and sent a quiet report to Ambassador Lean Dahl, the senior diplomat aboard the Meridian. Dahl was a silver-haired woman in her 60s who had spent decades talking to species who wanted nothing to do with humanity. She read Riva's report, then read it again, then called Riva to her office. "You did this on your own time?" Dahl asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You mapped his decision-making patterns from intercepted speeches." "He repeats himself," Riva said. "Once you see the structure, it is not complicated." Dahl studied her for a long moment. "How old are you?" 19. "Where did you learn signal analysis?" "Lagos. My uncle ran a radio repair shop. I learned to listen before I learned to talk." Dahl almost smiled. "Almost." She told Riva to pack a bag. She was being added to the diplomatic party. Captain Afani Bello approved the assignment without argument. He was a calm, broad-shouldered man who believed in letting his crew prove themselves. When his first officer raised an eyebrow at a teenager joining a high-stakes diplomatic mission, Bello simply said, "Dahl asked for her." "That is enough for me." The Hetari had invited the human delegation aboard their command station, a massive orbital fortress called the Pale Throne that hung above Saren 4 like a metal moon. The invitation was not a gesture of respect. Everyone knew that. The Hetari did not negotiate. They demonstrated their power and then told you what was going to happen. The invitation was theater. Riva packed light. A change of clothes, her datapad, and a small handheld device she had built herself back in Lagos. It was a portable strategic simulator loaded with thousands of historical battle scenarios from Earth's military history. She had been playing it since she was 12. Her friends back home had thought it was a weird hobby. Her uncle had told her that understanding how people fight teaches you how people think. The Meridian docked at the Pale Throne on a Tuesday, Earth Standard Time. The airlock opened onto a corridor that was 3 stories tall and lined with trophies from conquered worlds. Weapons, flags, artifacts, skulls. Each display was labeled with the name of the species it had been taken from and the date of their surrender. There were 41 displays, 41 species, 41 surrenders. The human delegation walked through the corridor in silence. Riva counted every display. She read every label. She noticed that the trophies were arranged not by date, but by strategic difficulty. The easiest conquests were near the entrance. The hardest were near the end. The Hetari wanted visitors to feel the weight of inevitability growing with every step. At the end of the corridor, Commander Drisik was waiting. He was enormous, nearly 8 feet tall, for arms folded across a chest plated with natural bone armor, eyes like polished black stones. He wore no uniform, only battle scars. He looked down at the human delegation and smiled. It was the kind of smile that showed every tooth. "Welcome," he said, "little ones." Riva looked up at him, said nothing, and memorized the way his eyes moved. The war gallery of the Pale Throne was built to break the spirit of anyone who entered it. It was a circular hall the size of a stadium, and every surface was covered with holographic projections of Hetari victories. Fleets burning in orbit, cities falling, species kneeling. The projections moved in slow, deliberate loops, replaying the final moments of 41 different civilizations in vivid detail. Commander Drisik walked Ambassador Dahl through the gallery like a museum guide, except the museum was filled with the deaths of entire worlds. "The variety lasted 6 days," he said, gesturing at a hologram of insectoid creatures fleeing a burning hive city. "They had excellent ground forces, useless in orbital combat." He moved to the next display. "The Shurim lasted 9 days. They tried to negotiate halfway through. We accepted their surrender, then finished the campaign anyway to make a point." Dahl listened without expression. She had been doing this kind of work for 30 years. She knew when someone was trying to intimidate her, and she knew that reacting would only give them what they wanted. Riva walked behind the delegation, carrying a datapad and pretending to take notes. She was not taking notes. She was studying the holograms. The war gallery was arranged in a specific pattern. The holographic battles were not random displays of glory. They were positioned around the room in a formation that mirrored Hetari fleet doctrine. The largest victories were at the center. The flanking conquests were placed on the sides. The surprise attacks were near the exits. Drisik had built his trophy room in the shape of his battle strategy. He probably did not even realize it. It was instinct. The way he thought about war was so deeply part of him that it leaked into everything he created. Riva quietly mapped the layout on her datapad. Across the gallery, Subcommander Othik stood near a pillar and watched. Othik was shorter than Drisik, older, with a scarred face and only 3 functioning arms. He had served Drisik for 20 years and had learned to pay attention to things his commander ignored. Right now, he was paying attention to the human girl. She was small, young. She stood at the back of the delegation and never spoke. But her eyes were moving constantly, tracking the holograms, the room layout, the positions of Hetari officers. She was not afraid. She was not impressed. She was reading the room like a book. Othik filed this observation away and said nothing. Drisik finished his tour and brought the delegation to the center of the gallery, where a massive table had been set with Hetari refreshments. He invited Dahl to sit and then launched into what he clearly considered the main event, his opinion of humanity. "I want you to understand," he said, settling into his chair with all 4 arms spread wide, "that I hold no hatred for your species. You are simply new, young. You have had your little wars on your little planet, and you think this makes you ready for the galaxy." He chuckled. "It does not." He leaned forward. "You sent diplomats. Diplomats. To negotiate with the Hetari Dominion. Do you know what the last species who sent diplomats looked like after we were finished?" He pointed at a hologram near the ceiling. It showed a species that looked vaguely like tall birds, their feathered bodies scattered across a battlefield. "The Peluri you are trying to protect," Drisik continued, "are grass eaters, prey animals. They have no military, no fleet, no weapons. They came to you because no one else would listen to them. And you came to me because you think talking will save them." He shook his head slowly. "It will not." Dahl folded her hands on the table. "We are here to discuss terms, Commander. Nothing more." "There are no terms," Drisik said. "Saren 4 belongs to the Dominion. The Peluri will be relocated. This is decided." The silence that followed was heavy. Drisik's officers shifted in satisfaction. Another species about to learn its place. Then Drisik smiled again, and this time it was playful, almost friendly. "But I am not without entertainment," he said. "I have a proposal. My tactical simulation chamber is the finest in the sector. It has modeled every major battle in Hetari history. I propose a demonstration. He stood up. A war game. My fleet against yours. Simulated, of course. If your delegation can survive 10 rounds against my strategy, I will consider your petition for the Pelyuri. If you cannot, you leave this station and never return. His officers laughed. 10 rounds against Drisic was a death sentence, even in simulation. No species had ever lasted past 7. Dahl did not look at her security team. She did not look at Captain Bellows' liaison officer. She looked over her shoulder at Riva, who was still standing quietly at the back of the room with her datapad. Riva met her eyes. The smallest nod, barely a movement at all. Dahl turned back to Drisic. We accept. Drisic clapped 2 of his hands together in delight. Wonderful. Wonderful. This will be quick. Behind him, Othic was still watching Riva. The girl had put her datapad away and was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the holographic battle formations above. She was not nervous. She was not excited. She was ready. The tactical simulation chamber sat deep inside the pale throne, behind 3 sets of armor doors that required Drisic's personal authorization to open. It was the most secure room on the station, and Drisic treated it the way some beings treated temples. The chamber was circular, 40 meters across, with a holographic projection system built into every surface. When activated, it transformed the entire room into a 3-dimensional map of whatever battlefield the user chose. Ships, planets, orbital stations, asteroid fields, all rendered in perfect detail, floating in the air at a level so commanders could walk among their fleets and issue orders by touch. Drisic had spent decades perfecting his strategies in this room. Every conquest in the war gallery had been rehearsed here first. He knew every function, every setting, every trick the system could perform. It was his territory. He chose the battlefield personally. Sarin IV's orbital space, the exact region the Hetari currently controlled. The simulation populated the room with 2 fleets. The Hetari force was massive. 12 capital ships, 40 escort vessels, over 100 fighter squadrons, plus orbital defense platforms and supply chains stretching back to 3 supporting systems. The human fleet was a fraction of that. For capital ships, 15 escorts, 30 fighter squadrons, no orbital platforms, 1 supply line. The disparity was intentional. Drisic wanted the humans to feel the gap. The rules are simple, Drisic announced to the room, which was now filled with his senior officers, all watching from elevated observation platforms. Standard Hetari tactical protocol. Each round represents 1 strategic cycle. The simulation calculates outcomes based on fleet positioning, resource allocation, and engagement orders. I will command the Hetari fleet. He gestured grandly. Choose your commander. Ambassador Dahl stepped forward, and every Hetari in the room expected her to take the console herself. She was the ranking human. Protocol demanded it. Instead, Dahl stepped to the side and extended her hand toward the back of the delegation. Riva, she said. Riva walked forward. She was still carrying her datapad. She wore a standard crew uniform with no rank insignia worth noticing. She was 5'4" and looked like she should be in a university lecture hall, not standing in the war room of a galactic conqueror. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Drisic laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was a full, roaring, 4-armed belly laugh that echoed off every wall. His officers joined in. Some of them literally slapped their thighs. One of them had to steady himself against a railing. A child, Drisic said, wiping his eyes with his upper left hand. You are sending a child to play war with me. Riva reached the console and looked down at the controls. They were designed for Hetari hands, large, spread apart, with tactile interfaces meant for 4-armed operators. She studied them for a moment, then began adjusting the input settings to work with 2 hands. She did this calmly, like someone adjusting the seat in a borrowed car. Are you ready? Drisic asked, still grinning. Riva looked up at him. Yes. The first round began. Riva did almost nothing. She pulled her fleet back, consolidated her supply line, and positioned her escorts in a defensive screen around her capital ships. It was the most basic, cautious opening possible. Drisik pushed forward aggressively, exactly as his doctrine dictated. He advanced his capital ships in a broad wedge formation with escorts on the flanks and fighters screening ahead. It was textbook Hitari. Overwhelming force applied directly, leaving no room for the enemy to maneuver. Round 2. Riva retreated further. She gave up an entire sector of orbital space without firing shot. Drisik's officers chuckled. She was running. Round 3. More of the same. Riva yielded ground, contracted her formation, and kept her fleet tight and small. Drisik occupied 3/4 of the map. His supply lines were stretching, but his force was so large that it barely mattered. She does not even know how to attack, one of the Atari officers muttered. Round 4. Riva made her first offensive move. It was tiny. She sent 3 escort ships on what looked like a scouting run along the edge of the map. Drisik swatted them aside with a fighter squadron and did not think about it again. Round 5. Everything changed. Riva touched her console and issued a rapid sequence of orders. Her entire fleet shifted, not forward, not backward, but laterally, sliding across the map in a pattern that no one in the room had seen before. Her capital ships separated into 2 groups. Her escorts scattered into what looked like chaos. Her fighters disappeared behind an asteroid cluster. Drisik frowned. The formation made no tactical sense by Hitari standards. There was no center, no witch, no clear line of attack or defense. It was just pieces spread across the board in a seemingly random scatter. He shrugged and began his 6th round. He targeted the nearest cluster of human ships with his main battle group, intending to crush them before they could regroup. His fleet moved forward. Then the simulation updated. The 3 escort ships he had swatted away in round 4 had not been scouting. They had been laying sensor mines along his supply corridor. When his main fleet advanced, the mines activated and cut his rear supply line completely. Simultaneously, Riva's fighters emerged from the asteroid cluster and hit his flanking escorts from an angle his formation was not designed to protect. His wedge, built for forward momentum, had no rear defense. In one round, Drisik lost 1/4 of his simulated fleet and all of his forward supply capacity. The laughter in the chamber died instantly. Riva looked at her console and said nothing. She was already planning round 7. Drisik stared at the holographic map like it had personally insulted him. His fleet, which had dominated the simulation just 1 round ago, was now bleeding. The supply corridor was severed. His flanking escorts were scattered. 26 ships had been eliminated in a single coordinated strike, and the human girl at the opposite console had not even raised her voice. She had not raised her voice once since the game started. The Hetari officers on the observation platforms were no longer relaxed. They stood straight, arms folded, watching the map with the focused silence of soldiers who recognized trouble. Sub-Commander Othic had moved closer to the edge of his platform, his 3 remaining hands gripping the railing. Drisik pulled himself together. He was a conqueror. He had broken 41 species. 1 bad round meant nothing. Round 7. He reorganized his fleet. He pulled his capital ships into a tighter formation, closed the gaps in his escort screen, and established a new supply route through a secondary corridor. It was a solid recovery. Standard Hetari doctrine for regrouping after an unexpected loss. Riva watched him do it. Then she attacked the secondary corridor. She had positioned a small group of ships in that exact area 2 rounds earlier, during what everyone had assumed was her chaotic scatter. They had been sitting quietly, powered down, invisible to Hetari's sensors. When Drisik routed his new supply line through their position, they activated and tore it apart. Round 8. Drisik had no supply lines. His fleet was running on reserves. He slammed his lower right fist against the console. The sound echoed through the chamber. Nobody spoke. Riva did not react. She touched her console gently, as if she were playing a musical instrument, and repositioned her fleet for the next phase. The strategies she used were unlike anything the Hetari had encountered. Each one came from a different chapter of Earth's long, bloody history of warfare. The supply line ambush was drawn from submarine warfare in the Atlantic. The flanking attack with hidden fighters was modeled on cavalry tactics from the Mongolian steppes. The initial retreat that lured Drisik into overextending was a strategy older than gunpowder, used by armies that fought with swords and shields. Riva had spent 7 years studying these battles on her portable simulator. She knew them the way musicians know songs. She could play them from memory, remix them, combine them, adapt them to any situation. Earth's history of conflict was not something she was proud of, but it was something she understood deeply, and right now, it was the most useful thing in the room. Round 9. Drisik abandoned his standard doctrine entirely. He began improvising, throwing his remaining ships at Riva's positions in rapid, uncoordinated strikes. He was trying to overwhelm her through sheer aggression. It did not work. Riva had already modeled this behavior. She had studied Drisik's communications, his speeches, the layout of his war gallery. She knew that when he was frustrated, he stopped thinking in formations and started thinking in anger. Angry commanders make predictable mistakes. They attack whatever is closest. They focus on damage instead of strategy. They forget about defense. She let him attack. She absorbed the strikes with her escort screen, sacrificing small ships to protect her capital fleet. Each time he committed forces to an assault, she counterattacked somewhere else. She was not trying to destroy his fleet all at once. She was bleeding him slowly, pulling pieces away, forcing him to chase her across the map while she controlled where every engagement happened. By round 10, the round that was supposed to be the humans' finish line, Riva had not just survived. She had gained control of the center of the map. Her fleet held the orbital space above Sarin 4. Drisik's remaining forces were pushed to the edges. The 10-round challenge was over. The humans had won the bet. But Drisik did not stop. "Continue," he said, his voice low and hard. Othik stepped forward. "Commander, the terms were 10 rounds. The humans have met the condition. We should continue." Drisik did not look at him. His black eyes were locked on the holographic map, on the blue markers that represented human ships sitting where his fleet should be. Riva looked at Ambassador Dahl. Dahl gave a small nod. Riva turned back to the console. Rounds 11 and 12 were methodical. Riva stopped playing defensively and began pressing forward. She moved through Drisik's broken formations like water through cracks. Every time he tried to form a new defensive line, she was already past it. Every time he gathered ships for a counterattack, she dissolved into scattered groups that struck from angles he could not cover. He was fighting the way the Hetari always fought, head-on with force and structure. She was fighting like something he had never seen before. Fluid, unpredictable, patient. By round 12, Riva controlled the entire map. Drisik's remaining ships were surrounded. His command vessel sat alone in a shrinking pocket of space, ringed by human markers on every side. The simulation was waiting for his next order, but there was nothing left to order. Every move was a loss. Every direction was blocked. The chamber was completely silent. 30 Atari officers stood on their platforms, watching a teenage girl from Earth hold their greatest commander in a cage made of strategy. Drisik sat motionless at his console, all 4 hands flat on the surface. He said nothing. For the first time in the history of the Pale Throne, the tactical simulation chamber was completely silent. The holographic map still glowed in the air, filling the room with soft blue light from human fleet markers and the fading red of Hetari positions. There was almost no red left. Drisik's command vessel sat alone in the center of the map, surrounded on all sides. His fleet was gone. His supply lines were gone. His escort screen, his fighter squadrons, his orbital platforms, all eliminated or captured over 12 rounds by a force 1/3 his size. The simulation's targeting system had locked onto his command vessel. A single prompt blinked on Riva's console, asking if she wanted to issue the final engagement order. She did not press it. Instead, she looked up from the console, across the room, directly at Commander Drisik. He was sitting rigid at a station, all 4 hands still flat on the surface, his black eyes fixed on a map above him. He had not moved in 2 full minutes. Riva held his gaze. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, no triumph, no mockery. She looked at him the same way she had looked at the console, calm, focused, and completely present. "Game over," she said. Her voice was quiet. It carried across the silent chamber without effort because there was nothing else to hear. No officers laughing. No casual chatter. No sounds of victory celebrations. Just those two words, spoken simply like a fact. Drisik did not respond immediately. His jaw tightened. His upper arms pressed harder against the console. For a moment, the room held its breath because everyone in it knew what Drisik was capable of when he was angry. But he did not shout. He did not slam the console. He sat there, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening, like a door being forced wide by something that could not be pushed back. "How?" he said finally. His voice was rough. "Tell me how." Riva stepped away from her console and stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the ghostly holograms of the battle she had just won. She spoke the same way she always did, plain, direct, without decoration. "I studied you," she said. "Your speeches, your war gallery, the way you arrange your trophies, your fleet formations, even the way you talk to your officers. You repeat patterns. Every commander does, but most of them face enemies who also repeat patterns, so it never matters. You conquered 41 species, and every one of them fought you the same way." She paused. "They either tried to match your strength, or they tried to run from it. Those are the only two responses your doctrine is built to handle. When someone matches you, you overwhelm them with numbers. When someone runs, you chase them down. Your entire strategy depends on your enemy doing one of those two things." Drisik's eyes narrowed. "And you did neither." "No," Rivas said. "I did both, and neither, and everything in between. I changed strategies every 2 rounds. I used tactics from different centuries of human history, from different continents, from wars fought with completely different technology. You could not predict me because I was not using one system. I was using all of them." She looked around the room at the Hetari officers, who were listening with an intensity that bordered on fear. "Humans have been fighting each other for 10,000 years, she said. "We have fought on land, on water, in the air, in space, underground, in deserts, in jungles, and cities. We have fought with rocks, with swords, with guns, with missiles, with information, with economics, with ideas. Every generation invented new ways to fight, and every generation after that invented ways to counter them. We have more recorded military history than any species in this galaxy, and we have spent centuries studying all of it." She turned back to Drisik. "You are a great commander. You have never lost because you have never faced an opponent who could think in more than one way at a time. But humans think in 100 ways. We have to, because we spent our entire history fighting the most dangerous enemy we ever encountered." Drisik stared at her. "What enemy?" "Each other." The chamber held that silence for a long time. Then Subcommander Othik stepped down from his observation platform. He walked across the chamber floor, past the holographic wreckage of the Hetari fleet, and stopped in front of Riva. He was twice her height. He looked down at her with his scarred face and his 3 functioning arms, and then he bowed. Not deeply, not dramatically. A slight forward tilt of his head and shoulders. The Hetari gesture of acknowledgement between equals. "She did what no species has done in 40 conquests," Othik said, turning to Drisik. His voice was steady and clear enough for the entire chamber to hear. "She made us predictable." Drisik sat alone at his console, surrounded by the proof of his first defeat, and said nothing. Riva stood in the center of the room and waited. She was not in a hurry. She had nowhere else to be. The negotiations began the next morning, and they were nothing like what the Hetari had planned. Commander Drisik had spent the night alone in his war gallery. His officers knew this because the security logs showed no one entering or leaving the hall between midnight and dawn. What he did in there, nobody asked. But when he arrived at the negotiation chamber, something about him had changed. He was still enormous, still armored, still intimidating. But the casual arrogance that had defined every interaction with the human delegation was gone. He sat down across from Ambassador Dahl and said, "Let us talk." Dahl had been waiting 30 years for an alien commander to say exactly those words and mean them. She did not waste the opportunity. The negotiations lasted 6 hours. Dahl was precise, patient, and fair. She did not push for humiliation. She did not demand apologies or reparations. She asked for three things. The Peliuri would be allowed to return to Saren 4. A demilitarized zone would be established around the planet, and a permanent human diplomatic office would be set up in the sector to mediate future disputes. Drisik agreed to all three. His officers were stunned. Some of them looked physically ill. The Hetari Dominion had never given back a conquered world. It had never accepted a neutral zone. It had certainly never allowed another species to set up a permanent presence in Hetari-controlled space. But Drisik had not agreed out of weakness. He had agreed because the simulation had shown him something he could not ignore. The humans had not beaten him with superior technology or with a bigger fleet or with some secret weapon. They had beaten him with thought, with adaptability, with a depth of strategic experience that made his 41 conquests look like a single chapter in a very long book. If one human girl, with no military rank and no combat experience, could dismantle his best strategy in an afternoon, then what could a species of 8 billion such minds do if they decided to fight for real? Drisik was not afraid. He was intelligent enough to recognize a threat that could not be measured in ships and weapons. Humanity was not dangerous because of what they had. They were dangerous because of what they were. And they had chosen to send diplomats. That choice, he now understood, was not weakness. It was mercy. While the negotiations continued, Riva returned to the Meridian. She did not attend the talks. She had done her part, and she had no interest in politics. She went back to the communications bay, sat in her usual chair, put on her headphones, and resumed her decryption work as if nothing had happened. Captain Bello found her there an hour later. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for a moment before speaking. "You know what you did back there will change things," he said. "I played a game," Riva said without looking up. "You changed how an entire galactic power sees our species. That is not a game." Riva pulled one headphone off her ear. "It was a simulation, Captain. Numbers on a screen." He would have agreed to talk eventually. Ambassador Dahl would have found a way. Bello shook his head slowly. "Maybe, but it would have taken months. You did it in one afternoon." He paused. "The Galactic Relations Office is going to want to talk to you when we get back." "I know. Are you ready for that?" Riva put her headphone back on. "I will figure it out." Bello smiled for the first time in days and left her alone. 3 hours before the Meridian undocked from the Pale Throne, a private communication channel opened between the station and the ship. It was addressed specifically to Riva Osei, Junior Communications Analyst. It was from Subcommander Othic. Riva answered it in the empty communications bay, her feet tucked under her in the same cross-legged position she always used. Othic's face appeared on the screen, scarred, serious, and looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read across species lines, but might have been respect. "I have one question," he said. "Ask. How many humans on Earth can do what you did?" Riva thought about it. She thought about her uncle in Lagos, who could listen to a broken radio and diagnose the problem in seconds. She thought about her classmates at the academy, the ones who played strategy games in the common room until 3 in the morning. She thought about the millions of people on Earth who studied history, who played chess, who built simulations, who argued about tactics in online forums, who read about ancient battles for fun. Thousands, she said. Maybe more. I'm not special. I just paid attention. Othic stared at her for a long moment. Then he disconnected without another word. He went directly to Drisik's quarters and delivered the message. Drisik listened in silence. Then he stood up, walked to the viewport of his private chamber, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, in a small, unremarkable solar system orbiting an average yellow star, there was a wet, noisy, overcrowded planet filled with billions of creatures who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of outsmarting each other. And they had sent a teenager to prove it. Drisik stood at that viewport for a very long time. He thought about his 41 conquests, his undefeated record, his war gallery full of trophies. He thought about every species that had surrendered, fled, or been crushed. And for the first time in his career, he felt something he had never expected to feel toward a species he had once called the softest in the galaxy. He felt grateful. Grateful that humanity had chosen to send diplomats instead of warships. Because if this was what they could do with words and patience, he did not want to find out what they could do with anger. Across the galaxy, The word began to spread quietly, passed between traders and diplomats and intelligence officers in dozens of languages. Earth was not to be mocked, not because humans were the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but because when a human child could humble a conqueror with nothing but patience and pattern recognition, it meant something that every species needed to understand. Humanity's true weapon had never been technology or muscle. It had always been the mind.